this drawing at the end, but I'm going to spend more of the time going over what's happening here. All right. Okay. So this is our hypothalamo anterior pituitary trophic hormones. Okay, this is that axis that we've been speaking about. So we've got instruction coming from the hypothalamus via the portal circulation to the anterior pituitary. And we're going to talk about the hormones that are released there. We then have the anterior pituitary sending its own hormones out into the systemic circulation. We'll talk about what these hormones are. And then we have the endocrine glands themselves receiving that instruction from the anterior pituitary. These are the glands in question, and they are then going to release their own hormonal or endocrine secretions, okay? And so this creates this axis or this hierarchy that we've been describing. So as far as the hormones that are released from the hypothalamus, we have prolactin, releasing hormone, sometimes called PRH. This is going to tell the anterior pituitary to release prolactin. We also have prolactin inhibitory hormone, sometimes called PIH. This is going to tell the anterior pituitary to not release prolactin. So we have the releasing hormone that is instructing the anterior pituitary to release prolactin. And then we have the inhibiting hormone, which is telling the anterior pituitary to not release prolactin. We then have thyroid releasing hormone, sometimes called TRH. That is going to instruct the anterior pituitary to release or secrete TSH. We also have cortisol releasing hormone that is going to instruct the adrenal medulla to, adrenal cortex to, hang on here. We've got the cortisol releasing hormone, CRH, is going to instruct the anterior pituitary to release ACTH, okay? We then have GHRH, growth hormone releasing hormone. So that is going to instruct the anterior pituitary to release growth hormone. We then have GHIH, growth hormone inhibiting hormone. That is going to tell the anterior pituitary to not release growth hormone, okay? So again, the releasing hormone and the inhibiting hormone. And then lastly, we have GnRH. This is gonadotropin releasing hormone. And this is basically going to instruct the anterior pituitary to release FSH, follicular stimulating hormone, and LH, which is luteinizing hormone, okay? And you don't have to be too worried about the acronyms here. You will get these acronyms on an exam. So even if you don't know the actual words, that's totally okay. You will see these acronyms on your exam. So that is the first layer of our hierarchy, the hypothalamus releasing these hormones, either releasing hormones or inhibiting hormones that are instructing the anterior pituitary to then do something else, okay? So let's go down here and see what happens beyond that. So the anterior pituitary will now release prolactin, and that is going to instruct the breast to release milk, okay, to produce milk, excuse me. So prolactin is going to be the production of milk, whereas oxytocin that we spoke about before coming from the posterior pituitary is going to be in the ejection of milk. So two entirely different functions as it pertains to milk projection and ejection. Thyroid stimulating hormone, TSH, is going to tell the thyroid gland to release T3 and T4. We'll talk about T3 and T4 production, which are coming from the thyroid gland. We then have ACTH, so adrenocorticotrophic hormone, is going to tell the adrenal cortex. So really important here, we have another kind of dual situation like the pancreas, where the adrenal gland has the medulla. That is where we saw those chromaffin cells, but it also has the outer region called the cortex. And the cortex is the region that is specifically involved in endocrine function, okay? So the adrenal cortex. And so the adrenal cortex is then going to result in cortisol production, cortisol being one of our main stress hormones, and we'll talk a lot about its function later on. Then we have growth hormone being released from the anterior pituitary. Growth hormone will have an influence on our liver cells, some of our other body cells, such as our bone and muscle cells, and it's going to instruct those cells to secrete insulin-like growth factor, which is a protein/hormone that causes growth production, right, or increase in growth. And then lastly, FSH and LH, so follicular stimulating hormone, luteinizing hormone, are going to instruct the gonads, so testes and ovaries, males and females respectively, to release androgens in case of the testes and estrogen / progesterone, which are coming from the ovaries in females. Okay. So this is just a general overview of these hormones and their tertiary secretions. We will talk a lot more about each of these hormones and each of their functions as we go through each of the regions in the next packet. All right. I'm going to take another pause here and see how we're doing with that so far. Okay. What we'll speak about last here are some other regions of the brain that are involved in this hypothalamic tropic hormone release. So we have neural input that's coming from neurons in the brain. We also have hormonal input that's having a negative feedback. So essentially some of those tertiary glands, those tertiary factors in this hierarchy are going to have a negative feedback influence on the hypothalamus. So let's say I have a lot of T3, T4 being produced. That is going to be a direct negative feedback input onto the hypothalamus to decrease TRH secretion. So if we go back here to this example, if there's lots of T3, T4 in the blood, that is going to have a negative feedback onto the hypothalamus to decrease the TRH secretion. Same thing if I have a lot of cortisol. Cortisol is going to have a negative feedback onto CRH. And so that is going to be one way that we can regulate some of these hormone secretions and regulate the release in general. And then the third input here is going to be the circadian rhythm. So essentially how much light or dark we're being exposed to can have an influence on the suprachiasmatic nucleus, so another cluster or region in the hypothalamus. So this is what helps us to be sleepy in the night and be awake and alert in the daytime because of the amount of light that's coming into the retina, which projects to this nucleus, the suprachiasmatic nucleus, and this controls our sleep-wake cycle, otherwise known as our circadian rhythm. Okay, so this is another way that we can regulate hormone release as well. So we've got nerves that are regulating here, we've got hormones that are regulating here, we've got the light and dark, which is the circadian rhythm, that is regulating these hormonal releases as well. Okay. All right, so here is another way of representing that. So again, it's just a bit more repetition here of this idea of this hierarchy. So we have our hypothalamus releasing tropic hormone number 1, which can be any of the examples that we just illustrated. That is going to instruct the anterior pituitary to release tropic hormone number 2, which again is any of those examples we talked about, prolactin, growth hormone, TSH, etc. And then that hormone is going to instruct the distant endocrine gland. So it can be the thyroid, it can be the breast, it can be the bones, the liver, and they are going to secrete hormone number 3. All right. And so that hormone will then have some type of target cell response. Now, as a part of regulating all of this, we have these feedback loops. So we have a long feedback loop, which is where that distant gland secretes a hormone. An example of a long feedback loop would be T3 and T4 having a negative feedback onto the hypothalamus. But then we also have a short feedback loop, which would be when the anterior pituitary hormone, that second tropic hormone, has a negative feedback influence onto the hypothalamus, okay? And so just to jump back here and again, really illustrate the difference between a long feedback loop and a short feedback loop. If we took cortisol, for example, cortisol production having a negative feedback onto cortisol releasing hormone from the hypothalamus, that is considered a long feedback loop. Whereas ACTH, so adrenocorticotropic hormone coming from the anterior pituitary, if we had high amounts of that, that would also be a negative feedback onto the hypothalamus, but that would constitute a short feedback loop. So the long feedback loop is going to be the endocrine gland hormones, so these distant hormones having a feedback onto the hypothalamus, whereas the short loop is going to be the anterior pituitary hormones themselves having a shorter feedback loop onto the hypothalamus. Okay. All right. And then lastly here, we'll speak about the pineal gland. Now, there's a lot that's not quite understood about the pineal gland, but we'll talk about the parts of it that we somewhat understand. It's a glandular outpouching here at the posterior aspect of the thalamus. So here it goes, sticking out at the back here. It secretes melatonin, and we know that melatonin is involved in our circadian rhythm, so our sleep-wake cycle. And so essentially, under the influence of that light that's coming into the retina that I talked about earlier, we're going to instruct via the suprachiasmatic nucleus, right? So this nucleus here, we're going to instruct, we're going to instruct the secretion of melatonin, and that is going to make us, that's going to make us awake, right? So melatonin is going to make us sleepy because of the inhibition of that, that signal. So let's say that again. So we have light coming into the eyes. That is a sympathetic signal that is going to inhibit the secretion of melatonin from the pineal gland, okay? Whereas if we have no light coming into the eyes, that is going to disinhibit the secretion of melatonin, and that is what is going to make us sleepy or tired or drowsy. And so it's going to be secreted from the pineal gland in the absence of light production or light introduction to the retina, and that is what makes us drowsy or tired. And that is what we mean by the circadian rhythm, that light-dark rhythm or cycle. Melatonin is also thought to be involved in our seasonal processes, especially in mammals. So this is what controls things like us being able to hibernate in the winter, being able to be more alert and awake and oriented during the summer months. And I'm sure we can all feel that, you know, there's usually this tendency to be a bit more depressed, more reclusive, more tired, more drowsy, to gain weight during the winter. Whereas during summer months, we have that change in mood, in affect, and in, you know, social interaction as well. And it's a lot more obvious in other species, but it is somewhat obvious in humans as well. It also plays a role in other timed events, such as the menstrual cycle in females, and the this is how your body has that internal clock of knowing when it's time to ovulate, knowing when it's time to have the cycles of those hormones going, and the uterine cycle, the ovarian cycle, et cetera, et cetera. So melatonin is also thought to be involved in the timed events of our body and those rhythmic cycles that are also associated with the endocrine system and reproduction as well.